This video is made possible by NordVPN. Go to nordvpn.com/VPEN and get a 2-year plan with a huge discount plus 4 months free. More on this in a moment. Maximum tension. Here on VisualPolitik, we have already told you how relations between Washington and Riyadh are not exactly going smoothly. In fact, they have been in the doldrums for years, and the truth is that things are getting worse and worse. The old alliance, the old partnership, the special relationship between Riyadh and Washington is becoming a thing of the past. And you know why? In a way, this chart illustrates why perfectly. We've talked about this many times. For years, Washington guaranteed the security of the House of Saud, the Saudi royal house, in exchange for the country's abundant supply of oil to the world market and to Wall Street, with the petrodollars generated by the business. It was something of a marriage of pure convenience. No mutual defense treaty or pact unites has ever united the United States with Saudi Arabia. But despite this, everyone was utterly convinced that if the House of Saud had run into any trouble, the United States would have rushed to its aid, even if that would have meant using all its military muscle. Not to mention the thousands of US military consultants who trained and in practice supported the Saudi military. However, the fracking revolution changed absolutely everything. Suddenly, the United States became almost self-sufficient in terms of oil consumption, and from that point on, you could say that the US began to see the Middle East through different eyes, and naturally, then came the divorce. But wait a minute, because we've already covered this in a past video that I'll link for you in the description. So the question is, why are we once again talking about Saudi Arabia and the United States here on VisualPolitik? Well, basically, because on the 5th of October, the Arab oil kings turned a deaf ear to repeated requests from the White House and announced an energy and political bomb.
OPEC Plus adds to biggest oil production cut since start of pandemic. Move to reduce daily output by 2 million barrels is likely to boost prices and help Moscow.
And here we have to highlight several key points. On the one hand, the energy crisis and the halt in oil and gas trade with Russia have made the Persian Gulf once again an indispensable supplier for the West. For example, European imports of gas and oil from the Gulf have risen from around 10% to more than 20% in less than a year. That is, they have doubled in just a few months. And that gives the sheikhs enormous market power. The petro-monarchies know this, and now they want to take advantage of it.
Right now, everybody needs oil from the Gulf. Everybody needs Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Some people in Washington definitely don't realize that there is a new Gulf and that we don't take orders from Washington anymore. Abdul Khalek Abdullah, Professor of Emirati Politics.
And VisualPolitik viewers, this is no trivial matter. Money is pouring into the Persian Gulf. We're talking about hundreds of billions of extra dollars. Specifically, the IMF is talking about a revenue windfall for the Middle East and Central Asian exporters of $320 billion. Keep in mind that that figure is just for 2022. And while the sheikhs bet on containing oil price increases in the past in order to punish fracking producers, now things seem completely different. Let's just say that the sheikhs want above all to replenish the royal coffers as quickly as possible. And that is exactly what they are doing. And also why they want to keep the price of a barrel of Brent above $100. Now the point is that this money grab is not the only geo-economic and political consequence. There is another one that has to do directly with Moscow. And that's because the measure approved by OPEC Plus to cut world crude oil production by 2 million barrels is a real boost for the Kremlin, just when the West is on the verge of approving its price cap on Russian oil. And as we shall see, this has not gone unnoticed. So the question is, are the sheikhs carrying out a gigantic bailout for Russia? Well, listen up. But before we go any further, let me tell you about one of the most common cybersecurity threats, malware. Have you ever heard of worms? Trojans? Unless you live on Mars, I'm sure you have. Along with viruses, they are different types of malware. It typically steals data or destroys it. It could be an exe file, run in the background as legitimate software, or even affect other devices on your local network. And how can we catch it? Well, it can be transmitted over email attachments, software downloads, or operating system vulnerabilities. And most important of all, how can we avoid getting infected? Well, you should keep your system updated at all times. Your PC, mobile phone, router. Be cautious of unknown email senders. Do not search, download, or install any software from dodgy websites, as those are the main source of malware. And of course, you can use the NordVPN threat protection feature to stay protected against malicious files. In addition to improving your protection against phishing, with NordVPN, you can surf without borders, choosing from over 5,400 ultra-fast servers from 59 countries around the world. What's more, you can use it on up to 6 devices on every major platform, Windows, Android, iOS, macOS, Linux. So don't wait any longer. Go to nordvpn.com/VPEN and get a 2-year plan with a huge discount plus 4 months free. And remember that you've got 30 days to change your mind, no strings attached. And now, let's get back to the video.
Storm in Washington.
In Washington, and particularly in the White House, it is very clear. The Saudis were the main culprits behind OPEC's decision to cut oil production, and the fact that they did so just before the midterm elections in the United States, and just when Putin's regime was having the worst time in the Ukrainian war, is something they consider almost like blackmail, which basically didn't surprise anyone. You see, during the election campaign, Joe Biden said that Saudi Arabia was a pariah country, and that he would treat it as such from the Oval Office. This was the current president's response to the brutal murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. However, the Russian invasion of Ukraine forced him to bite the bullet. The West suddenly needed to find alternatives in order to punish the Kremlin by cutting off oil purchases. But that was not so simple. After years of underinvestment in the industry, the oil and gas market was terribly strained. So the US president and many other international leaders had set out to find alternative sources. Along the way, Washington was even willing to reach out to countries such as Iran and Venezuela, with pretty dismal results so far, by the way. The fact is that the major Gulf producers have once again become the key players in this whole political energy saga. And so, in mid-July, Joe Biden himself invited Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. It was not the friendliest and warmest meeting in the world, but as a gesture, it marked a turning point. The White House was willing to restart relations with Riyadh if Riyadh would actively join the grand international coalition against Russia, or at least take steps to cool oil prices and thus some of the inflationary pressures that are punishing half of the world so severely. However, just 2.5 months after the visit, what almost everyone had already suspected was confirmed, that the trip was a complete failure. Far from announcing an increase in production, OPEC Plus, led by Saudi Arabia, and Russia itself, had announced the opposite. And believe me, that has unleashed the wrath of Washington. Especially when, only 5 days before the announcement of the measure, envoys from the White House traveled to Riyadh to ask the government of Mohammed bin Salman not to do so. But it was all in vain. So naturally, reactions were not long coming. Several senators, including Robert Menendez, the chairman of the powerful Senate Foreign Relations Committee, have already called for a freeze on all cooperation with Saudi Arabia, including military cooperation. In addition, several senators and congressmen, both Democrats and Republicans, have already announced their determination to push for new legislation to suspend arms sales to the Arab country. And now the possibility is even on the table that both the White House and Congress itself may reactivate the so-called NOPEC bill, a bill that seeks to prosecute, punish, and hold accountable oil companies owned by governments that are part of an oil cartel. Without digging too deep, this would be the case of Aramco, the all-powerful Saudi oil company. The White House itself now appears ready not only to change its foreign policy regarding the Gulf, but also its own energy policy for the United States. If the Biden administration has so far prioritized energy transition, that could be changing completely. So to be clear, fracking is back in vogue.
We're going to work with our US allies to increase production and make sure we have sufficient refining capacity. Amos Hochstein, energy advisor to Joe Biden.
Be that as it may, if one thing is crystal clear, it is that the OPEC Plus decision will mean more pain for Western economies, and particularly for old Europe, which, to tell the truth, has not been at its best lately. However, this is not even the most negative aspect. The most worrying thing is that cutting production just when Russia is having the worst time in the Ukrainian war and on the brink of winter seems to be a clear lifeline for Vladimir Putin's regime and a pressure measure against the West. And that makes it worse, much worse.
What Saudi Arabia did to help Putin continue to wage his despicable and vicious war against Ukraine will long be remembered by Americans. Chuck Schumer, Democratic politician and Senate Majority Leader. We see no reason why American troops and contractors should continue to provide this service to countries that are actively working against us. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE want to help Putin, they should look to him for their defense. Statement of House Democrats Tom Malinowski, Sean Casten, and Susan Wild.
So that begs the question, is OPEC really supporting Putin's Russia? Listen up.
The Bears Embrace.
In Vienna, at the OPEC Plus meeting that decided on the production cut, there were two major players: Saudi Energy Minister Abdulaziz bin Salman and Vladimir Putin's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, a guy who just days before had been sanctioned by the United States.
The presence of the Russian Deputy Prime Minister under US sanctions to discuss tightening of oil supply heading into a winter in which Russia has already weaponized its gas exports to Europe sends a clear message. Roger Daiwan, analyst at S&P Global Commodity Insight.
Let's be clear, the petromonarchies insist that cutting production is not a political issue, it's just business. However, one thing is very clear. The Gulf states have not condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine and have not supported any of the sanctions, and now they have not listened to their former US ally either. And here is the very important point that we cannot overlook. By far the country that has benefited the most from the production cuts is precisely Putin's Russia. Why? Well, let me explain. Unlike Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, or Kuwait, Russian oil extraction costs are much higher. In fact, it is estimated that, on average, they are double those of Saudi Arabia. We're talking about more than $40 per barrel. But that's not all. International sanctions and a lack of buyers have meant that Russia is selling its oil to countries such as India and China at discounts of up to $35 off the global quoted price. What's more, as you can see on the screen, redirecting Russian oil sales to markets as far away from production sources as China or India also implies much longer lead times and therefore higher logistical costs. To break it down, $40 extraction costs, $35 trade discount, and higher logistic costs means that selling below $80 per barrel and Russia virtually stops making money on its crude exports. So you can guess what price a barrel of Brent was just before the announcement of the production cut. Exactly, it was touching the $80 barrier. You see, the sharp economic slowdown in China and in general the worsening performance of Western economies caused the price of oil to fall by nearly 20%, from $100 in July 2022 to $80 at the end of September, and that was a terrible blow precisely for Russia. However, now with the production cutback, things are changing. Yes, Saudi Arabia will earn more money per barrel, but it will also extract and sell fewer barrels. The difference will be positive, but not that big. For Russia, on the other hand, the increase in oil prices make an enormous difference. Below $80 a barrel, the Kremlin earns practically nothing. And let's not forget that in 2021, oil profits covered 45% of all Russian public spending. In other words, in order to poke Washington in the eye, to reinforce the unity and position of OPEC Plus as the cartel that sets the international price of crude oil, and to benefit from the war, this time, the Gulf petromonarchies have decided, at least for now, to clearly align themselves with Moscow. And it's not just Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates, for example, has also happily seconded the production cut. Perhaps it has something to do with Dubai becoming the new Mecca, the new fashionable refuge for Russian oligarchs.
Russians flee to Dubai. Ticket prices soar to $5,000 as tensions rise over nuclear threat.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russians, and particularly Russian millionaires, have rushed to Dubai to buy property, set up businesses, and secure their fortunes. For example, in the UAE, buying a property valued at 750,000 dirhams, roughly $204,000 at the current exchange rate, assures you 3 years of residence. And of course, larger investments can secure you much longer. And although things are not as easy as they used to be for the Russians, especially when it comes to financial operations, they are managing to use Dubai as one of their new bases of operations. This, of course, is contributing to a whole new golden age for the city. You know the old story, business is business. But wait a minute, because this time the Arabs might not do so well.
The game.
One of the great mistakes that dictators and autocrats tend to make is to always overestimate the cards that they are holding. As they tend to be surrounded by sycophants and live in a kind of bubble where their word is law, they often end up risking more than they should. This is exactly what happened to dictators like Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, or more recently to Vladimir Putin himself with the invasion of Ukraine. Now, something very similar could happen to the Saudi leader, Mohammed bin Salman. Why? Well, because this latest move makes it very clear that Saudi Arabia is no longer in any way a reliable partner for the West. Oil production in the United States and the rest of the world is almost certain to increase strongly over the next few years, while the development of alternative energies, including nuclear power, will also accelerate. In other words, Riyadh's move may end up reducing the country's future profits. At the same time, military cooperation with the United States is essential for the kingdom, not only to be able to access the latest equipment and defend itself in the event of a conflict with a country like Iran, but also in order to maintain the thousands of jobs that have been created in the country. And of course, if the Ukrainian war has made anything clear, it is that when it comes to advanced equipment, there is no alternative to Western, and particularly US supplies. Above all, Saudi Arabia has been telling us for years that it is going to invest gigantic amounts of money to diversify its economy. However, for that to really happen, it needs to cooperate commercially with the wealthiest countries in the world. That is, with Western companies. And measures like this do not contribute in the least to that goal. In any case, what is clear is that the petro-monarchies have challenged the North American giant. The question is, what do you think the United States will do? Will Western countries be able to avoid falling back under the influence of the Arab countries? Do you think that this measure is purely commercial as the Saudis claim, or on the contrary, is it a political move? Leave us your impressions below and let's open up a debate. And of course, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Thank you so very much for watching. All the best. See you next time.